Hey everybody, this is Peter from the Spin Rack, and we also have
Calvin Ellis ready to rock.
today. I would like to bring up and go through the myth of the greatest editor-in-chief of Marvel Comics, and no people have taken that away from Stan. They've given it to Jim Shooter, right? Um, have you
Really,
heard that around the campfire?
they're taking the greatest editor of all time away from Stan Lee and giving it to Jim Shooter. Not
Well,
Mort Wessinger, Jim Shooter,
well, the,
not,
the
not Julie Schwartz or even Roy Thomas. Jim Shooter. Okay,
well, since it's
if I get a chance, if I see Jim Shooter, I'm going to ask him. Do you think you're a better editor than any of these guys over here? I'm pretty certain he deferred to at least one of them. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I
no, it's
hear some of
okay.
this. No, I hear some of this stuff, and it's so it's just like so much. It's just fanboying at the end of the day. Where enough guys say yes, and then it becomes four legs good, two legs bad. Where there's no thought process to it. There's no analysis. It's just hey, I love Secret Wars. Jim Shooter must be the best. At least that's what it sounds like to me, ostensibly. But I guess I'll learn more once we get into it.
Well, one of the things is obviously there's a lot of successes while he was there. You had obviously the death of the Dark Phoenix. You had Burn on Fantastic Four. You had Daredevil, Frank Miller on Daredevil. Thor on Walt Simonson on Thor. Secret Wars, as you said. Even though people still point out the initial success of Dazzler, but then you had stuff like Micronauts, GI Joe.
With the
Um,
exception, I think, with the exception of two or three of those you mentioned, they all have something in common. They all got their start at DC. They all got their start at DC Comics, but then I could make the same argument for the '90s.
I only want to bring this up to kind of say that the importance of Jim Shooter is not to be, or not to be gotten rid of, because he definitely got the books on time. Because Marvel had developed a thing where a lot of creators like Steranko or Neil Adams, they started to realize that they wouldn't have to struggle with editing and redoing if the books came in right at the edge before the deadline, and they would bring it in and they were like, I can't really do much. I'd like to change some things, but I got to get these books out. And from there, the 70s, they had many talented writers at Marvel, but they kind of would also play the game of being late. And then you'd see an issue of the Fantastic Four with a cover that related to the story before it, but the insides would be an old story from the 60s. And then they would even joke the deadline Doom issue that they had to use an old thing. And Jim Shooter kind of didn't do that. They also say he kind of paid for Marvel creators to go to cons and stuff like that to represent Marvel. And also, well, it wasn't him, because obviously you had it was Mike Hobson, who was the actual publisher while he was doing it. When Stan went to LA, he was the person who was, signing off on the creative incentive, which would be the 4% that the creators were getting during the 80s. But obviously, he was involved in it. But obviously, but the thing of it is, I wanted to go through. We know that Jim Shooter got his start as a kid, as a writer, sending in stuff to who you had mentioned before. Who did you mention before?
The late, always great Mort Wessinger.
And Mort Wessinger would buy the stories. They would come with, drawings, and he would talk it over. And then at some point, soon after, he found that he was a kid, and he said, "Let me talk to your mother." And they started a working relationship. Now, the early period was, I guess, those first couple of sales were fine, and then at some point, Mort started to dig in and giving Jim Shooter the business. And he was writing and being compared to Cary Bates, where Cary Bates was getting compared to Jim Shooter, and ultimately, I guess, to feel like Jim Shooter, to get the best out of him, he was doing Superman, created Parasite, worked on the Legion of Superheroes and Supergirl, believe they said he created Karate Kid, Princess Projecta, and Sun Eater, and the Fatal Five. Do you have any thoughts on that period of Jim Shooter's time at DC Comics?
I think a lot is overlooked by the creativity he had and the age that he was when he was working, because DC is primary at that point. DC is selling to kids who are younger than the kids who are attacking towards Marvel. On average, maybe about 4 years younger. So if your average DC reader starts at 8, your average Marvel reader says like 12, and then but it's cycled out. So Marvel readers might cycle out say 16, DC readers would rightfully cycle out at 12 and then go, and read the Marvel stuff. But I think he really had a mind for what readers wanted in terms of the characters. I love the stuff he did with the overall with the Legion. I love the stuff he did overall with the Legion, but even a villain like Parasite that he creates, where it's just a normal thing. Well, look, I need somebody who can fight Superman. This guy can do anything. I don't have any. Oh, what's the deal? Well, we get the kryptonite, take away the powers. Well, that's kind of boring, But what if we have a guy who actually is kryptonite? Well, what about the kryptonite kid? No, 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 no. This is kryptonite, but it doesn't just weaken Superman. It takes the powers too, and then he's got to like really think. Good stuff at the end of the day, especially if you get the chance to read some of those earlier stories. But I think I'm not certain what Shooter would say, but I think him being the age that he was, and probably still an avid reader, of the comics himself, and saying, yeah, this is some stuff that readers would want to read. We want to see that type of stuff, and was able to execute it. Probably also because he had Mort Wessinger giving him the business, and well, the best editors, at least at that time, they treated the talent, like they didn't need them. They would come over here, browbeat them. This is no good. That's no good. But they were always at this. Look, if I don't work these guys, I'm not going to get good stories. That was the motto that they had. I mean, and I think that lasted all the way through. That definitely lasted all the way through Shooter. Though I don't know. How, well, we'll get into that in a bit. But at least from that time period, that's one of the things that I noted.
And I would only say is he Jim Shooter also talked about how he got into comics was he took a year to kind of understand Marvel storytelling, and he kind of sold that to DC. Now, outside of say the Death of Pharaoh Lad, the style, how it was actually written, how it was in the pages, was not necessarily the people arguing the way that happened in the Marvel, but he would have elements that was in Marvel. But if you see how the books came out, they were definitely DC books, with maybe outside of obviously the Death of Pharaoh Lad connecting to like Reed Richards, Sue Storm and Johnny Storm, the death of their father, that sort of thing. But the drama in comparison to it was a heroic death of Pharaoh Lad, where he travels in this ship, and it's very straightforward, where it wasn't the Marvel kind of turn the panel, that sort of thing. So it was interesting to see that he would say that he kind of looked at Marvel to be his inspiration.
One other thing you should note.
Hmm?
One other thing. Sorry about that. One other thing to note is the Marvel deaths they tend to be tragic.
Mm-hmm.
They're rarely heroic, and I thought you aptly noted that Pharaoh Lad's death, you could call, but it's still heroic, and that keeps him with really what the DC heroes were mostly about. So if somebody made the ultimate sacrifice, definitely was tragic, but he was going to be revered and honored as a hero and the greatest hero of them all. That sort of thing, where the Marvel's deaths tend to just to be tragic, or the villain died off panel, or we see his foot and we just keep moving on.
So after this period, he decides on going to college, and then while at college, he decides maybe he should stick his toe back into comics, and he gets a job at Marvel, but nothing's kind of happening for him, so he goes back to DC. He's writing the Legion of Superheroes again, but he's running into some complications, and Marv Wolfman is like, hey, you want to come over and be an associate editor at Marvel? And he takes it, right? And he becomes, and then, but Marv is going so quickly, he becomes Archie Goodwin's assistant, right? So he's the associate editor, and he's quickly kind of moving up in the company. And Archie's he's only there for like a year. And at that point, they give Jim Shooter the job of editor in chief. Now, one of the things that I'd like to go towards the myth was that obviously people go to the X-Men and say Jim Shooter kind of put the X-Men together. He's the one that was during his time, and his kind of editing kind of brought it to limelight. Now, the X-Men was a book that was kind of struggling, and it was a book that Roy Thomas had put together. He brought them back in '75. He had the idea of having them,
Being very, very kind
what?
to the X-Men. You got to be, come on, you got to pound these dudes. These guys are top dog now. You can give them a good pounding.
Well, they were no, they were.
They weren't struggling. They weren't struggling. They weren't even being printed at one point.
I'm talking about when Roy Thomas brought them back as the new X-Men. He brought them back, and they were like, they were still struggling because it was a.
Yeah, the reprint sales were doing better.
Well, yeah, that's the hard part of it is that you had this thing with the most exciting. You had these visually dynamic characters done by a great artist in Dave Cockrum. You had Lean Wen, who's one of the top writers, writing Thor, Spider-Man, Fantastic Four, all of Marvel's top books. And then you have a book that just didn't find its audience, it wasn't finding its audience. And then Chris Claremont takes on there, he keeps it a roller coaster ride, and for some reason it's not hitting. Now, most people would say, oh, well, Jim Shooter put Byrne on it, and all of a sudden it happened. And Byrne, got the call from Shooter, but he got it from as Archie Goodwin's assistant. Now, it was unearthed much later that Archie Goodwin was worried. The Marvel was about to cancel the new X-Men. They were like, it's not selling. And Archie Goodwin said, to save it, if Terry Austin, you say yes to inking it, I'm going to ask Byrne to draw it, and it could finally go monthly. Terry Austin said yes, and then Byrne, thinking that, basically him saying he really wanted it, they gave it to him that way, but it was more kind of a last-ditch effort to get the title go monthly, and saying that would be the kick to get it to work. So once it started going monthly, and at the same time there was a buzz around Claremont and Byrne, later Austin, when the back issues would happen, but obviously it's a gorgeous work when you see Byrne and Austin together. But the combination of these two, even though they'd worked together before, that sort of friction, it kind of built up this title that Marvel's then Shooter's on there, and Shooter's basically comes in and starts forcing things on them. He comes in and says, all right, you gotta put in this Dazzler character. And they're like, what? He's like, okay, and they're going to introduce a new set of younger mutants to be like students, because Jim Shooter said they had to be students. So all right, we'll make a junior team, and he's like, no, you can't do a junior team. They look like they look like the Legion of Substitute X-Men. So he canceled that idea. But if you look the roadmap, they had this idea for this new team. Obviously, you know that they ultimately did a new team in the new mutants. So, and it's very lucrative. So it's like kind of weird, but you see that the plots that they planned, how it was kind of being gutted for adding Dazzler, getting rid of the new team, and the only one they got was Kitty Pryde. And then you have the timing of the Phoenix, where they kind of talk to, and this is the thing where I immediately go to when it comes to Shooter, because Shooter says that Claremont and Byrne had chickened out on their story. They came with a story where they had Phoenix do something terrible, and then they chickened out and just had her go home and be nice. And then when he said you have to do some sort of punishment, they said, just trying to see if he can scare him. He said, we'll kill her. And then he said, yes. And then and then they were like, no, what's wrong with him? He's crazy. So it's been kind of a push back and forth. And this is the whole kind of point of the myth versus that Shooter was actually the man behind the death of Phoenix, that they made this big mistake. They also chickened out of the storytelling. And then, of course, he said, I'll go with your idea of killing her. And then they just were forced into it. Whereas they were ultimately upset that Jim Shooter was gutting their plot lines as they were going along. They were running into no editorial interference until there was this big buzz around the book. And the next thing you know, it was like they couldn't do anything right as it was going on. So, but ultimately, the truth of the matter of Death of Phoenix was that it did happen where the difference was that Phoenix was supposed to become a villain. That's what they got to prove, that Phoenix would be a reoccurring villain. So they finally came up with something big enough. They made her a villain because Burns looking at it saying, well, the, the Shire attacked her, so she killed them, but that's not really enough for her to be a bad guy. So then he put the asparagus people there, and then Chris Claremont added in, like how they were dying, and he also added in that Lalandra knew that Phoenix was going to turn bad. That made it into this entity that she was a chaos bringer. They're just adding on to this stuff. And Shooter looked at it and he was okay with it, but he didn't turn to them and say, "Oh no, this is an issue." But then once he saw, he's like, "Nope, Jean has to be punished." And then he called up Byrne because Byrne didn't live in New York anymore. And this is in what's that thing? What's that book? Oh man, it's in the Phoenix the Untold story. Because Jim Shooter tried to get to who's the ultimate reason why she had to die, and Chris Claremont said Roger Stern, and Byrne defended it and said, "No, that was actually your idea." And then Chris Claremont got upset and was like, not really upset, but he just pushed back and said, "You're the one who said, I'm not doing that nastiness to her. I'm going to kill her first. I'd kill her first." So that's kind of how, and you see at the end of it, the both of them are still going back and forth of who actually killed the Phoenix. But Shooter is the catalyst to push them to do something with this. And they came up with the only option they could is that she was getting a raw deal and she would sacrifice herself for the universe. So, but ultimately, the title, this thing became bigger than imaginable after they did this. So now everyone deserves credit. The Shooter was involved, obviously, but and Byrne said the storyline obviously was better than what we originally planned. But it's funny when you read. Sorry, you were going to say something?
No, I think, well, knowing what I know of Shooter and the stuff that he did over at DC and what he was looking for as an editor, I think, yeah, I mean, you can, if some of the stuff that you can see coming from him, you can see directly from the things that he did over at DC and the things that worked. But I mean, this goes back to I was kind of laying the groundwork for it. But Phoenix's death, it's not a heroic death; it's a tragic one. She gets a raw deal, okay, but it definitely resonates in the Marvel universe because as readers, we know, hey, this is not really her fault. Yep. She was pretty much just doing the best she could do with the situation. She had an entity that she couldn't control. We know this whole thing. And then of course, you get the Shi'ar coming in, they're like, oh no, you don't. Okay, it was you. We don't want to hear anything about that. We don't know where this entity is, but we know it used you and you're still here. Okay, and somebody's got to pay for this, which is good editing on Shooter's part, saying, no, she can't just go back and do a Scarlet Witch like we do today. Oh, I'm gonna just wreck everything and then fly off with a new outfit. She does have to pay for that. That's what heroes are supposed to do. They're supposed to come over there and like, no, what I did was wrong. I gotta, do some sort of Greek expiation, if nothing else. And then we get a death, not the Farrelad death, not the heroic death,
Yeah.
even though what she does is heroic, it's still played as this tragedy.
So with this, that's what led me to kind of think about like stuff like Frank Miller on Daredevil, because I was only recently, because I remember that when Daredevil got the bigger buzz, because I was kind of buying the book from time to time. I had issues before that, and I think there's a fill-in that Steve Ditko had done. I bought the issue where Daredevil beats up the Avengers. I bought the issue that Steve Ditko, and I had maybe the Hulk. I think after the Hulk fight, where they go through the Daredevil's origin, and all those are written. They're drawn by Frank Miller, and they're written by Roger McKenzie. So at some point, I think I missed it wasn't until much later, I think, where it's Elektra's there and the Gladiator and her, they're all fighting together. I had that issue, and I think Elektra's death and some of those issues I said before that. But the buzz happened around there, whereas Shooter did, I think, was it Joe Duffy and maybe Denny O'Neil kind of put their head, said, hey, let's try out Frank Miller, even though they could see it was kind of rough around the edges. The art, he had somewhere to grow. Same like everyone at that period, like Byrne.
Or saw the hands and feet.
So
hands and feet came back later.
So so basically he did sign off on Miller becoming the artist. But one of the things that keep being forgotten is that what was it? Marvel was being faced where the artist and the writer were differing. Now, when the X-Men, well, Byrne ultimately made the decision to, like he obviously didn't get any rhythm that Chris Claremont was going to go, but he ultimately realized that when they got to a point where he didn't want to deal with anymore, he had to go. So he had a title. He obviously had the Fantastic Four, which we'll get to in a second. But Denny O'Neil was confronted with the artist. The artist wants to write, and the writer still wants to write. He's like, "What do I do here?" Right? So the artist has decided that he wants to write the book. He wrote a little short story with Elektra. Now he's ready to write the book, and he's just like, what do I do? Who's there? But he decided differently. He said, who's the person behind the success of this book right now? And he said, um, he said himself, if Miller does a bad job, maybe I can fix it in the editing. So he said he looked at it, saw that he felt that Miller was kind of the person behind the success of the book at this point. So he went with it, and he chose right. But every time they bring up the history, they always go to the shooter. I think Rob Liefeld said it many times. Shooter let Frank Miller write, where it's a little more complicated. They don't just immediately let you write stuff. Some people, like I guess Steranko, but or even I think because Jim Starlin, they knew he had some story ideas, and they let him try stuff out on Strange Tales on characters that weren't big. But you had Daredevil was a book that was, had a steady inker, and the inker was there. Klaus Jensen was there to keep the book in line. So it wasn't like he got it and he just let him go free. Ultimately, that happens after Denny O'Neil. And I just want to say, I want to bring that up because there's in print where Jim Shooter said Denny O'Neil's incompetent. And the only problem was that he thoroughly enjoyed the books that he edited. He edited Miller and Byrne, possibly other people. And Shooter was like, you're just letting these guys get away with murder. And the other side is like, Denny O'Neil said, guys, don't tell Shooter that I haven't been doing any editing. He likes saying, because you could hear from the den in the back of those letter pages that he was almost reading in the books as a fan. But I mean, obviously if he saw something glaring, he would point it out. But I think Shooter felt that they were getting away with murder with him, where he was thoroughly enjoying them as creators. That's what's the difference. So, and I think a lot of people feel that editors should be, basically get the book back and say, this is what's wrong, that's what's wrong, that's what's wrong, that's what's wrong. That sort of thing. So I just want to give him a little credit on there. But obviously, Shooter signed off on Miller becoming the artist on there. There's not, I guess there's not much else in there, but what do you think of this period before I get into my next thing on the Fantastic Four? What do you think of his period, this early period of Marvel? And could you see any signs as a comic reader that there was something that was going on, whether it just be the talent in general or by Shooter?
I was there in real time, and these were books that I was pretty much coming into because I was around, without dating myself, I was like right at the cusp of the age where you would have been a Marvel reader.
Mm-hmm.
So I wasn't coming in to say, okay, I had been reading I had been reading like Thor for a couple of years, and now Walt Simonson was on the book, or I had been reading, no, well, that's not true. I had been reading some titles, but these weren't the titles that got, that got that jump, at least in this time, at least with that. They weren't, they didn't, oh, man, I'm tripping over my own words. These weren't titles that were part of that wave, if you will, that might be attributed to Shooter being editor in chief. I had been reading Spider-Man for a bit before. I had been reading Spider-Man for a bit before that, and probably the Hulk. But the other titles, I mean, I never read X-Men in real time. I've always read it, coming after the fact. So I wasn't there. I wasn't there when a bunch of that stuff was going on, or at least I wasn't reading when a bunch of that stuff wasn't going on. But I mean, for me, yes, in terms of, hey, he was there, he was in charge, and you got to get the accolades and stuff hits. But I also look at the talent that that you had at that point. I would think that if you look at Frank Miller and you look at the art that he did on Daredevil, not the storytelling, but if you look at the art that he did on Daredevil, I would say arguably that's the best art he's ever done. And it's that run on Daredevil, that particular art. And then afterwards, you go, especially once he gets more freedom to do stuff. I think the first signs of that are Dark Knight Returns #3. Not necessarily as tight. And it's not that the art is bad, but I think the high point is what he was doing at that point there. And you could definitely see the seeds of the type of stories he wants to tell, but given the freedom to do that. And if there's any plus, you see, I mean, Shooter by every account is a hard-nosed editor, and he's sitting this and he's reading it and he's loving it until he realizes he's got to get after Denny O'Neil.
Mhm.
Oh man, I can make such a bad joke about Denny O'Neil now, but I won't do it. God rest his soul, I will not do it. And then
Mhm.
you look at I don't know, you look at some of the, I mean, I would love to drag Walt Simonson into the whole thing, but Walt Simonson, I think, is just a totally different animal where he's just got a lot of natural gifts if you allow him to execute. But at the end of the day, Shooter was the man in charge, and trust me, if things had gone downhill, he would have definitely been the man that everybody wants to throw scat at right now. So I was just coming in, so I didn't really have much to compare it to. But yeah, I can't, without a doubt, it was good. It was great stuff. Enjoyed it, from start to finish, with the exception, of course, of the stuff that I wasn't reading.
Well, I just one of the things that you could see if you look at the like having so many books be like successful. Like I think the next thing I was going to bring. Well, at the same time, before I guess when he was in between the associate editing and editor in chief, and he was doing the Avengers with George Perez, and it was a very strong run. So it's like he seemed to still have those storytelling chops. He had a lot of stand in him where Cap is calling, insulting Iron Man. But he slowly towards the end of his time on the Avengers, he slowly starts to move away from them arguing all the time and getting out of that portion. And I don't know if it was more Shooter, Perez kind of, because Perez would moving away from them just trying to beat up each other to just having them work as a team. Captain America being not the last man standing, but the guy who would get inadvertently knocked out of a fight because he's a human, which was classic for me. But there's a lot of fun stuff during that period as a writer. So when I had a couple of issues that he the Bride of Ultron and his back issues having the Count Nefarious storyline. So he had done a pretty solid run on the Avengers before that. And so while the X-Men was kind of rolling, the Fantastic Four didn't have a writer, and Byrne had asked to do that. And then soon after leaving the X-Men, there was the idea of either what's the name, Bill Sienkiewicz would do Moon Knight and Fantastic Four, or both. And then they kind of talked it through, and then Byrne was doing the Fantastic Four. Now this is the first initial thing after the height of the X-Men. And since with that power, he kind of he didn't roll it back time wise, but the look, he kind of rolled back to the first 20 issues. The costumes were looser, more like designed the way they were by Kirby early on. And that caught some things where people kind of looked at the FF and said they just should always be bulky. They should always look like the later period, where that sort of thing. And Byrne kind of played with that. So it was kind of thing where you could hear that from, I think from John Romita, that Shooter the book was selling, the book had jumped in sales, but at the same time, all he really wanted was like the mold be the same way. Don't change the mold type of thing. Whereas Byrne was looking at it and saying, hey, they knew that the FF kind of, even though it was selling okay, had kind of lost its way, and the book sales were up, but at the same time, it still was a thing that kind of him wanting to revert back to the way it was kind of done in the 70s, not necessarily the early period that was done by the Jack Kirby. So they were he didn't run into it, but shoot, as Byrne was saying, there was a new editor every couple of months until he rounded up with one where he was kind of having a back and forth with. But the Byrne was like, they don't know how long they, I wanted this title, so they weren't going to get me off that way. But at the same time, all this period, there's basically no war between Shooter and Byrne. Like Byrne is defending him in the press. They're buddies. I think the same with Miller said the same thing. Like he learned a lot of storytelling stuff. He said, but he said at some point, he said we just started disagreeing with everything, including the shape of the planet. you know, and Burnett talked about the Captain America run being stopped short by Shooter saying you can't do 3-issue storylines anymore unless it's as good as the first Galactus story. You can't do that. And they were like, no, it's not, Burn, not that. Then who's the name? Craig Miller also said it. He said, yeah, he said for some reason, like Jim didn't want us to do continuous stories anymore. You know, so it was like, this is what Stan and Jack, this is their big thing to comics. So, so it's like kind of it's corroborated that way. We had some ideas storytelling wise. Now you can say these ongoing, you know, obviously he was struggling with, you know, ongoing storylines that never ended. But if you see how Chris Claremont would do his, they were almost like single issue continuing stories. They'd have its own arc. So it was kind of a trick that Marvel created, like how Byrne did his Negative Zone storyline. We were like, you had to have a beginning, middle, and end of a story, even if it was like a 3-parter. Like you could do a 2-parter, but for long, like it's 6 parts to Byrne's what's the name, to his Negative Zone story. You couldn't start with them fighting Annihilus issue 1 and fighting him at the end. It had to be this other sort of thing. You could have subplots going, but they had the story itself had to be beginning, middle, and end. So they kind of tried to. You see Claremont doing a lot, even though he had the Brood storyline that was forever. There's a thing where he goes into vampires. All this stuff is happening in between this. I was like, how are don't they have the Brood eggs in them? How are we getting this this Dracula story? So you can see the Marvel guys were, you know, appeasing their editor-in-chief, but at the same time, we as fans, we kind of always stuck with the long 20-part storylines, unless it was the Excalibur, the Cross Time Caper. But the last thing when you brought up, which was that's not the last thing, but one of the things that you brought up was Walter Simonson. Now, I think they give Shooter credit for that, but Walter Simonson was a period doing, what's it, Star Wars? And he was drawing Battlestar Galactica. And how he got to doing his own writing was Archie Goodwin was like, hey, the Battlestar Galactica doesn't have a title. You should write it. So he started writing the Battlestar Galactica. And Thor, which at times was written by Shooter, by Doug Mensch before he leaves, and a couple other people that are around the office, but the sales were really low. So you have to look at the editor. And this is why I bring up the editors, because we don't give Tom DeFalco credit for the success of you know, X-Men #1 being 8 million, Spider-Man #1 being 3 million, and X-Force being 4.5 million. We don't give Tom DeFalco any credit for the Punisher, none of that.
In all fairness, while Tom DeFalco is without a doubt one of the better editors at Marvel, those characters of franchises are juggernauts by that point. So he's not going to get it. It's like well, you know, that's what I was going to say is a totally different thing. But you know, just to offer some contrast, by the time you get X-Men #1, they're a juggernaut. You had, you know, one of the, if not the top selling title at Marvel, and then you put Jim Lee on it as well. What do you what else? The only place it could go is up, and then you get, you know, the Punisher was already like a rocket at the end of the day. So they're going to attribute that more, which is ironic. I have to admit, they're going to put that more on the character than the people and the production behind the whole thing. Whereas we go back 10 years, it's all about the production and not the characters.
Mm-hmm. So with that said, going back to Walter Simonson, when he went to Mark Grunwald and he was saying he wanted to do Thor, and Mark Grunwald was like, you can do whatever you want. Like, we're about to cancel this. It's like, here's a list of things you could do, but ultimately, whatever you can do to make the book work. And the only thing he did see on the list was giving someone else the hammer, which he was like, they kind of had Loki pick up the hammer at some point, but it was so long ago, and he did it with his magic. So he's like, hey, that might be fun. And that was his initial storyline. But as far as editorial input, ultimately he was only supposed to be there for 12 issues. I think they were going to the comic store the one that Dixon worked at, they were basically saying this is only 12 issues, and luckily it was much longer than that. But this is where you get a storyline there's 4 parts, but even that's same, it had 4 parts, but each storyline ends with an arc with a cliffhanger, which I think Shooter didn't like full page. If you ended on a cliffhanger that was a splash page, he didn't like it because it was like the ad for the next issue. So it's like, that's like an ad for the next issue. But ultimately, we got to give Mark Gruenwald a little credit. But there's one big thing that if you go to, I don't have it up here. Let's see if I go back, it'll go to it. If you go to his things, some of these things you can't always go to, but if you go to his jimshooter.com, he has one thing that's, I think, the most important thing of his career. Not as important as getting the book on time, not as important as keeping some of the talent that was there, the artists, writers that were doing books there. But the thing, I don't have it up on this page, but one of the big things is that back when Roy Thomas started giving back original art, different from DC, DC would give the artists all the artwork. Because Carmen Infantino being an artist, so the art part of it being the artist, so you give that back to him. Roy Thomas, being editor-in-chief at the time, and deciding to give back stuff from the 70s, not stuff from the 60s, he said, hey, these pages, these boring pages with a lot of dialogue, we're going to give a couple of those pages to the writer, right? So, and the writers would sell those pages for whatever amount of money, 50, 25 bucks, that sort of thing, or they trade with the artist or inker. And they ran into where Shooter decided that the writer shouldn't get nothing. And that's how he probably first got in trouble with all of the writers, because they were like, you're cutting into our side money and we're creative too. And he's like, well, no, the art part, this should just go back to these guys. And because I think only one I know, Byrne said Roger Stern would just give the art back to whatever art pages he got, he would just give it back to Byrne, type of deal. But this was a big, on his website, he has a thing of people writing to him, complaining, Chris Claremont, a bunch of people upset. So, but I think it's important that the artists got back the entire portion of it as is. And at the same time, I do feel that the writer should have been able to sell those plots, because that would be great.
You can't sell a plot.
I would, come on, if there was a Bill Finger plot, then could they say how?
That's you, man. We're talking like the average comic reader. You, me.
What I could do with those plots?
Look, maybe you, me, and a handful of other people. But comics is a visual medium. Nobody's putting money for the first thing. Do you know how hard it is to sell an actual comic book? And how these dudes like getting? I mean, I've had guys who want me to take pictures of the comic in sunlight. I've literally had that request. Can you take the book and put it in sunlight? That way I can see the, and I'm like, what is the difference between sunlight, okay, and false light, as I would like to call it? What's the difference? What do you want next? UV, black light? That's where these guys go. And then to get a script where they can, oh man, how do I know this is authentic? How do I know somebody didn't just punch this up? Somebody just sit down it would be crazy. Especially if it was signed or anything. Oh, there's a stain on it. Look at this coffee stain. Yeah, it's a script. Guy worked on it at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And then it's a visual medium. I agree that the artist should probably get first go at the script, without a doubt. But I do think the writers, should get some pages, or at least a pick. Say like, do like, 80-20 or something, and the writer's like, well, look, anything, if it's, maybe get like one splash or something of that nature. You did write it. The guy didn't just come up with the whole thing on his own. And, the whole thing, it is a collaboration at the end of the day. I understand where the artist is coming from. Like, hey, I put in this, I'm going to sell this art. You sell these scripts. I was like, I can't sell this script. Everybody's coming in here because of the visuals. Okay, they're coming in because of the visuals. You know that. You got me over a barrel when it comes to that sort of stuff. But comic guys aren't. I'll put it this way: if the story was as important as it should be, as both of us would probably love to see it, then when I sell comics, I would be selling comics on all these great storylines. And comic collectors have told me more than once that's not what they're interested in. They're interested in great cover art. They're interested in errors. They're interested in double covers. Okay, but the story, oh, forget about it. I go to the cons. I'll see guys like Peter Tomasi, great writer. He's got scripts there. Those scripts stay there. You know what sell? The trade paperbacks that he has there with him. They don't. Nobody cares. They just don't want it.
Well, I mean, because it's interesting. I seen. It's funny because some of those they'd have Chris Claremont at some point would sell his plots, but if you look at the plots to the art, it was interesting to see because most of the time they were written after they talked on the phone. So Byrne would draw it, and Chris Claremont would write like a plot out that he would send to Marvel to say this is kind of what we're doing, and then but there would be kind of a gray area which made it interesting. So it's like, and one of the things that, well, with that said, I just feel that that's how he immediately fell out of favor with all of the rest of the guys, with Marv and Len. It seems like Roy was diplomatic about it. He was just like saying, hey, Jim, not about the artwork, but just saying, hey, Jim has an approach of how he feels storytelling should be. And, I'm not one to say that he's wrong type of deal, but, it's just how his approach. So someone else might have a different approach. So, but you can see with the kind of the more Western, which you brought up, is that, kind of him feeling how he's always kind of felt that, these guys have some storytelling weaknesses where he doesn't have any kind of weaknesses. And you could see, now we could all kind of, pick apart something and say, oh, he should have done this and that. And it seemed like one of the aspects that I think Kirby and John Buscema would say at times, which is not the best thing, but it's kind of saying, hey, this right here is good enough for comic books. And I'm not saying in the sense that they were getting away with doing something bad, but at the same time, you have to look at it and say, you have this book rolling, you have a talent. I can't fault, Bob Harris for not adding more stuff to those X-Force issues that Rob Liefeld did. Ultimately, you got a horse going, and Marvel had done that before. It's like, hey, we just hired Paul Gulacy, and we hired him because he looks like Steranko. Can we give this guy some work to do something like that? And that's how we got. They had them take over. Master of Kung Fu, and all they do is they take the Steranko stuff and go beyond that. So ultimately, at times, with especially Marvel, you're saying, hey, we got this guy that we know we have him here for just this. Let him do whatever he wants. Oh, wow, it's a cult book. Yeah, that's what we wanted. We wanted we know the kids like the Steranko stuff, and we're going to it's almost like giving them some more Steranko type things. So it's like, sometimes you need to kind of play to that and not always be like, hey, let's now, like, obviously, like Miller, Byrne, what's the name, Walter Simonson, these guys are like pulling out all the stops to kind of be, whereas ultimately all they needed to do as writers to say, here's a list of villains. Get will fight this villain and that villain next issue and this villain next issue. And this, as a kid, that's what I thought comic book writing is about. Just pull a line of villains and come up with a story and have them fighting with it. Like, here's, we start with a boring.
Comics were still about that now.
Yeah. Well, so we
still got the Bendis storyline where it's about fighting each other and moaning for 12 panels on a page. That was for the longest period of time. That was it. You were supposed to tune in every month, and what was the challenge or the villain they had to fight or what was happening from last month, and then it's slowly but surely came about their personal problems.
Well, I want to do something probably soon about us talking about comic book writing, but one of the things you can see, and this is we're going to tell to the end, at least just as Marvel period, and maybe we'll come back and do some other, but the success and the extreme success of Secret Wars, even though he had done a second run on the Avengers, which I don't know if it's like a little over a year, but it's remembered because what happened to Hank Pym. But not to get into that, Secret Wars is more important because it was extremely successful, and he had an idea of these characters, even though he had X-Men selling like crazy, had Fantastic Four, one of the top sellers, and he had what a Thor selling again. It was like Thor was like, it was like Spider-Man, Fantastic Four, and Thor was in the toilet for who knows how long. Now that was selling, but the approach to those books were very different. And where Shooter was writing Secret Wars, it was like, I have Cap and I have my everyman Spider-Man. And if Tony Stark wasn't drunk, I'm pretty sure Tony Stark would be in that triumvirate of the coolest characters in Secret Wars. And you can see his approach was that he didn't really see the characters the same way. Even though they had these big successes, he kind of saw the X-Men as students of Charles Xavier, so they would kind of fall over their feet from time to time, while he would study them while they were working. He came with a perfect dynamic where Xavier's mental powers basically was useless, with Enchantress kind of turning them off. So he basically could just sit around and look. Well, you could do that somewhere else, not walking around and nobody tries to shoot Xavier. But I think he and Thor kind of is outside of issue 2. Like, he's kind of not really in the book anymore. After that, he's kind of in the background, but he doesn't really do too much in there. And Reed Richards, who went back to being in the Byrne run, kind of the strongest will in the Marvel universe, to be like, hey, my wife is pregnant. Like, how much he did when she was pregnant the first time? Like, he went to the microverse, went to the negative zone. Like, he went everywhere during her pregnancy. So, like, Reed is not gonna, like, to save the universe, he's gonna understand that he's gonna still be needed and not be like, hey, Cap, you take leadership. I got to worry about my wife. I don't even know if I'm going to come back to see her. Where he kind of puts things in perspective. But ultimately, the success of that led to another success in Secret Wars. You want to chime in about Secret Wars? I think I wasn't too mean on it. What do you got to say?
Oh, well, not a great story. But I think Secret Wars, I always said that most times you're coming into comic books rarely bring you into comics. It's usually something else. Like, you started with the cartoons and eventually you learn to read. So, you get into the comic that way, or the toys. And I thought Secret Wars was a perfect catalyst for a lot of the Marvel zombies that I would end up knowing and growing up with as a kid, because you had these toys and you had a perfect, it was a perfect catalyst and a perfect gateway for these guys coming into the Marvel universe, which I did not fully understand at the time, because I wasn't reading Secret Wars exclusively. That's what not brought me in. I had been reading other stuff. And then, I was, still like, okay, I'm reading this other stuff. And then Secret Wars came out. I was like, all right, so I'm reading this too at the end of the day. And I didn't realize that for a lot of guys, Secret Wars that was what brought them in. That was that was the storyline that brought them in. So of course it's awesome and it's excellent. This also, for better or for worse, cemented who these characters were, you know, for a lot of readers at the end of the day. And I mean, that's why you look and you see a character like Spider-Man, and he's over there, handling the X-Men with no problem. And the guys who come in, that's who Spider-Man is. He's this guy who can come over, bounce around, beat all these dudes. You can't get Spidey. We expect to see him punch Galactus out if he's got enough web fluid. But it was that particular series. So I mean, even when I read it as a kid, I never thought it was this really great story. I was always definitely more partial to the Crisis, which definitely had its own issues. But I forgot, and I'm just remembering this recently. That this was the storyline that brought in a whole bunch of readers. This is the first time they experienced these characters, and how angry or how critical can you be of the first story that you not only enjoyed but made you a lifelong comic reader.
Well, I think there's definitely something to that. I would say that initially the idea, seeing I bought Captain America that Mike Zeck had done, even though I was not too keen on what was going on with I was trying to stick with the Avengers. And there's a classic issue where they have the new lineup where they say have Wolverine and Silver Surfer on the cover and a bunch of other Spider-Woman. When that issue came out, I was so pissed off at the Avengers because they had a comic drive, a team up lineup, like almost like 12 issues before that. That's where I kind of came on there, where Hank Pym got into the whole storyline. So I was so pissed off that they needed another membership drive that I was just like, this is it. I'm done with this book. But ultimately, I didn't really take that on as, because at that point, I think we're just starting to say who our favorite creators and writers are. So it was like when I'd see books take turns that I didn't like, I'd almost question why are the characters acting this way and kind of trail off. Or when Spider-Man, in my mind, was a little tougher, like he has a cool character in the Tarantula, and he just wipes the floor with them, so he has to shoot himself up with his own some radioactive spider thing that turns him into a monster. I was just like, no, I don't know about that. I don't want to see a monster tarantula. Tarantula's got a cool costume. Just give him some sort of power so he can fight Spider-Man. Like, I don't want to see him, some angry Mexican who decides to shoot himself up. He's got like a Mexican spider. He's still got the hair.
That was the problem, because at some point it became that the tarantula was a loser,
Yeah.
and it was like, why? He didn't need the powers. You just guys needed to make him competent in terms of what he originally was supposed to be. I
Mhm.
mean, Spider-Man is still the character who was having trouble with Fancy Dan from the Enforcers. It
And
shouldn't
I was enjoying that too.
it shouldn't be that. It should not be that difficult. I mean, Fancy Dan is probably like one that nobody gets, but Spider-Man would have trouble with Captain America and Daredevil. These guys would just, I mean, he's not trying to kill these guys. And yes, he wants to come over, we can lift 10 tons, he can lift, yeah, that's great. He's not trying to punch people out. So let's say he's not using that full strength at the end of the day. And these guys would be hard to handle. These guys would be hard to, I mean, we're talking web fluid, speed, all the stuff that he has. And these guys would still present a significant challenge, for Spider-Man and keep it in the pocket at the end of the day. So why is the tarantula a punk? That was just that they decided he was going to be a loser. And then at some point they were like, well, let's try to make him, let's try to get him to the point where he's a credible threat and everything. Oh, I know. Let's make him a real tarantula. That didn't work for Spider-Man when you gave him the extra arms. You got rid of that. So,
Yeah.
why is it going to work for this guy? And then, of course, once it happens, what can you do? You got to kill him. He's a monster.
Yeah, so that's the thing, and at the same time, as a tarantula, he couldn't hit Spider-Man, still couldn't hit him. So with the added strength and his own spider sense and whatnot, now the spider sense Spider-Man had, early on, he didn't even realize what was going on. Of course, when the tarantula had it, it would started to drive him crazy. So like, nothing is going to work for this guy. Everything is, well. As a kid, the little I knew about science, I started taking it as, I just think Spider-Man's power is that the laws of physics work in his favor. So he fights the Hulk. The physics work where if he hits the Hulk and Hulk hits his head against the wall, Hulk might get knocked out. In that case, because that's kind of how, or I think
Physics, that's a Lifetime movie.
but so going back to Secret Wars, ultimately, I think I didn't really understand. So in going with the characters as me, not as still having a kid in me thinking the characters are not real, but as close as you can think of it as what you do as kids, and saying they're not acting they're acting in the books that I'm already reading. And so I'm not getting it. And when they listening, Wolverine says Cyclops is a jerk, but he's our jerk. And I was like, no, you're the jerk type of deal. But it was kind of through Shooter's filter and the X-Men needing to leave. So even by the Spider-Man part, but them deciding we need to leave, that's also a bigger issue for me. So it was kind of wacky, but at the same time, it was a big success. It kind of there's other things, man, we've talked about it, the memos where he kind of felt like, wow, I'm doing it right, and he would kind of exert that power onto his the other people, telling them what they were doing wrong, and look to Secret Wars 6 to how to do this right and that sort of thing. But he ultimately did Secret Wars 2, and as much as people can say that, I could say some bad things about it, that was successful. That was a mega crossover. Every book they had no choice, but they had to be involved in it.
And that was, again, that's a testament to good editing. It's okay, because, oh man, that's like some Hollywood stuff right there, where you look and the movie did well. And what's they automatically do? We're making a sequel. And he's like, but we only got no, we only got one story. Are you kidding? Look how much money we made. No, we're making a sequel at the end of the day. And this time we're dragging everybody into it.
Yeah.
It was impossible for that thing not to be successful. You know,
Mhm.
I mean, because it was one of the, and then if you had the same mind frame that I did for Secret Wars, if you were somebody and your favorite character wasn't part of that initial Secret Wars thing, then you were definitely on board because it was going to cross over with every issue now. So you definitely wanted to see how the character who didn't make it in was going to be highlighted. So somebody like Doctor Strange or Daredevil or Nick Fury, guys who look, they're not going to be part of that lineup. Oh no, they're going to be a part of this lineup at this point, and let's see how they all interact with it. And then if you were a completist, which a lot of guys didn't realize at the time, you got every issue. I'm probably one of the few guys who still has a complete collection of Secret Wars 2 and all the crossovers.
Wow, that's crazy.
Yep.
My
And
cousin,
you can buy them for a reasonable fee. Just contact us at spinnerack.com.
okay, so with the success of those things, there's a different thing that he kind of brought through that Marvel continued afterwards. Is the like when Jack Kirby left the Fantastic Four, the biggest person hurt by that was Stan Lee. Like Stan Lee didn't necessarily see the Fantastic Four without Kirby, and you could hear it in this Rolling Stone interview where he was still kind of this before the Funky Flash Man, and he's still reeling from it. Whereas I think post Stan, it was like if you lost a creator lost a book on a title, it was almost like, hey, it looked like an open slot for like a Lamborghini, and it'd be like, we got this Lamborghini now, we can do whatever we want, whereas like kind of seeing that, you can see that there was no big thing of saying, hey, no, I guess you could say, I guess with the Fantastic Four, it's harder to say because when creators were leaving, you could see it more with the X-Men, but it was just like, hey, we got this Lamborghini. No, what we're gonna do? We're gonna put this editor on it. No, I'm running into problems with Burn on Hulk. We're gonna put Al Milgrom on the Hulk, and it's just like, well, this is a drastic. I like Al Milgrom, but this is very drastic to do this. And you can see, and DC would do. I mean, obviously, Mike Carlin kind of taking over Superman titles post Burn, or Denny O'Neil not really keeping a big name creator on Batman, like the Denny O'Neil Batman. This is like, so I'm not saying that approach that Shooter had, but Shooter he was still trying to bring in people because he got Steve Englehart to come back to Marvel and do West Coast Avengers and Fantastic Four. So he gave him books that were not like low profile. He wanted them to do it, but it was a feeling like sometimes, hey, if we lose this guy, we'll just put this editor on it. And I don't think he did it across the board, but it's like, it was kind of a thing where it's like, it'd be easy enough to do. So we'll get to the last stage of him, which at Marvel was be the new universe, which I'd say the biggest fault is trying to do a new line. If he did two issues or one issue and see how well it sold, did a mini type of deal, because Marvel hadn't really done a whole universe. Even when they did the Marvel universe, they would slip in heroes into their what's the name, the 2-in-1 type title, like two different 3 or 4 stories in one, the analog titles, and they would introduce something. And Marvel had that, they said a book had to be canceled so they could put out another comic type of deal. So when you saw Avengers #1, or what else is it? I guess Spider-Man, or I guess Amazing Fantasy is what got canceled, and they did Spider-Man. But they would always have to cancel a book to put a new book out. So it wasn't like they introduced a whole line and said, here's a line of heroes that we want to do, and this is the universe. They were like gradually putting it out. And I think, thinking of a Marvel universe, he's one of the first to say, here's the universe. You got a universe. Oh, wait, no, he did it with the Star. I don't know the launch of the Star universe, but it felt that it was kind of all at once. But I don't know that for sure. I'd have to look at it. But the new universe was just all at once. And I was in Flushing, and I missed the initial launch, but they had all those books sprawled out in this Flushing comic book store, a comic book store I loved. I used to go as a kid when I used to go to school in Flushing for I think 3 years. It's like I guess four, kindergarten to third grade, and I'd only get there from time to time. So they had all the new universe titles sprawled out there, and I got all the new. As any good collector, I got all the new number ones, and I went home and I was like, I'm only going to be buying this Star Brand issue after this. Like, these books are not it. And there was a different approach. There was an approach where we kind of did a flashback to his origin every issue. And he had some, I think it was more for me for the art that I liked. But by issue 4, I think I kind of realized there was no more way this book could go. And issue 5 kind of proved that, where his girlfriend was kind of psychotic, and then the Albin Sur of the book, if you know, from like Green Lantern, the guy who gives him the power, he comes back to life and he goes on this murderous rampage. And I was like, wait a second, Albin Sur doesn't come back and kill. So I think just the approach was a little, you know, obviously the effort wasn't strong, but if he slowly put out a book and if it didn't work, then he put out Cyforce or DP7 or Mark Hazard. If he would try those books slowly, because they'll kind of, you know. Now, how close do you believe that? Do you believe that DC was going to give Marvel its books, like 8 titles? Do you believe that?
Hell no. That's a great story, and I think some people. I know the story, and I know Shooter's involvement and what he's reported, and I'm positive that there was probably some discussion, some lower level discussion, you know, on DC side with Shooter. I'm positive that that happened. However, Shooter is the top guy over at Marvel, you know, in terms of being editor in chief. He wasn't speaking with the editor in chief over at DC. That wasn't happening. And then once like somebody higher up got wind of it, they were like, "What the hell?
Yeah.
No, you're not. No, we're not doing that. You guys." And that means that's something significant to recognize, because as bad as the sales were, and I'm putting bad in quotes, as bad as the sales were for DC, they were still savvy enough to say, "No, we're not giving you. No, absolutely not. That would totally undercut anything that we're trying to do. And then long term, if you guys take off, we're married to you. You know, it'd be the same thing like with Marvel and Sony right now. It's like, what are we going to do? I'm like, no, we're not doing that. You're out of your mind." Just to get back what you were talking about with the Star Universe and the new universe, or Star Comics.
And Star Comics, yeah.
Because I remember the promotion for Star Comics was pretty late, to my recollection, but I still saw it. And they came out, they had less titles coming out, and the promotion for the new universe was significantly more. And again, the irony is that Star Comics were much more successful than the new universe ever was at the end of the day.
You're wrong for that. You're wrong for that.
Yeah, hey, they just were. The approach for the new universe is pretty much what Image Comics would become later on, to an extreme. They were going for the realism, and they got toilets, and the toilets really work, and people have to use the bathroom in this universe. They were going for that type of realism. They wanted to like out Marvel themselves, I suppose. It didn't really take. Star Comics, however, Heathcliff was outselling every single book. Heathcliff was outselling every single book from the new universe. Heathcliff, that's just to show you, don't mess with Heathcliff. Wow. Win every time at the end of the day. But that contrast I thought was pretty striking at the end of the day. The readership was not there yet. If they had tried that thing, the new universe is what? It's effectively the Image. It's effectively Image Comics and the Ultimate Universe that would come later, because they were trying to go with what, guys. If I'm a speedster, then I gotta I can run at these speeds, but then I gotta eat a ton of food, and trying to do that type of stuff to add more realism to it. And Marvel Comics had already added, more realism to superhero comics than DC ever did or was ever going to do at the end of the day. But the readership just wasn't there for it. What the readership was there for was Star Comics, but we discussed this already. I think they made themselves a little thin in terms of like, hey, well, they had a hit with Star Comics that they didn't have with the New Universe. So they were like, hey, we can do this with everything. You know, what's hidden? Heathcliff, we're gonna license everything. Madballs, Strawberry Shortcake, doesn't matter, doesn't matter. And I think you would have to stop and say, hey, we had two properties that didn't sell for us in terms of He-Man and Thundercats, and these things are really popular
Yeah,
in terms of
yeah,
the cartoons and the toys. What's not hitting here? Maybe because we're not actually paying enough attention to these titles, because DC's had a great love affair with He-Man and the Masters of the Universe over the years. Marvel had that one series, they did 13 issues and never tried to revisit it. Thundercats has been hit or miss depending on. Well, no, Thundercats has actually has done okay over at the DC when they decide to pop up there. But yeah, that was I always found that really interesting, because you would think that the New Universe would have been the one to like really hit, because that's what ended up, those type of comics ended up hitting later, but it was Star
yes,
Comics.
yeah. I would always go to the way you described it was very interesting because it definitely would be like the superhero dynamic. Because I immediately go, this is like Vertigo before Vertigo. But I think the ultimate thing is a little better. But the ultimately understood that they needed to have some action in it. And at the same time, when I was bringing up DC, being Marvel, DC giving the stuff to Marvel, this is the pompous idea. Sorry, I'm going to finally have to say something negative. To say we can fix DC characters. They had Starbrand it's supposed to be a Superman, but it's definitely the origin is so similar to the Green Lantern.
Yes, spot
Yeah,
on.
you have the DP7, which is Doom Patrol. It's got the letters and the initials. You got Kickers, which is the Challengers of the Unknown. You have I couldn't say Cyforce, but I go to Merc, which is when I said Merc, Mark Hazard Merc. That's obviously a present day, what's the name, Sergeant Rock type of deal. And the other ones, I'm not sure. I can't really call a direct thing to all of them, but those are the ones because I know there's a Robot one and Spitfire and Cyforce. So I'm not sure about those as far as DC. Outside of maybe the what's those guys?
Night Mask.
Hmm? Oh,
I thought
Nightmares.
Night Mask, they were trying to do another Spider-Man character.
Yeah,
Okay,
Nightmares. Huh? Yeah.
okay,
Well,
you're pretty
Sandman.
spot on.
Sandman. Yeah, yeah.
Pretty spot on. Yeah, yeah, that would
So
be if Spider-Man meets Sandman. You got the younger character, you got the younger dude, and definitely the Sandman powers, or dream stuff happening in a dream state or in a dream world, if you will. But yeah, that's spot. Yeah, it's yeah, spot on with the DC stuff. But Marvel's been doing that for years. I mean, the amount of Superman analogs they have in the Marvel universe is, you would think, hey, DC would be like, hey, if you guys create one more analog, we're going to sue you at the end. And they've done so many because they understand, look, if we could get this right, we're golden. And, none of those, that character just doesn't work in the Marvel universe at the end of the day. Most of them don't. And the Marvel versions of them don't tend to take too well, but that's what they were going. I mean, anybody who read Starbrand and didn't think that was Green Lantern was a Marvel zombie who had no idea who the hell Green Lantern was.
well, I would say that's the hard part is the I guess the comic that's the best one kind of done is Starbrand, but it's not for the ultimate story. Like the B and C plots of Ken Connell's sexual exploits is the comic. Like he ultimately should have just done a romance comic because I think this is based on his real life escapades. Like that was way more interesting than have him having a girlfriend who had a kid. His steady girlfriend was a girl had a kid, and then he has this other girl who's an airhead who has a rocking body that that's his bottom B. That she'll do anything for him type of deal. He rolls up on the beach like the Starfriend rolls up on the beach, sees a hot woman, winds up in bed with her, and she's like, "Please don't leave, please." And I think his psychiatrist, where they kind of say that they were such great friends, the psychiatrist was really poking at Ken Kana all the time because he had this group discussion and he had like all of these people there. And one of the people he had over was one of Ken Connell's ex-girlfriends. and he's like saying, "Oh, hey, how you doing?" He kind of has that motion like guys have when you see someone you ain't called back, and she's like, "No, that's fine. I can understand it. Only problem is my son. He kind of has been asking for you, and I don't really know what to say about it." It's just like, dag, this guy. So when people say like how much he was turned to into a heel afterwards, like, nah, he was kind of a heel beforehand. But that's what made the book kind of interesting. You had John Romita Jr.'s art, and you had this interpersonal stuff that really is not something that you can really celebrate, but it was the most interesting part of that whole thing. So I'm going to end it here to say, sadly, not sadly, but he was, as a talent and the person who had done a lot of good stuff for Marvel at those I guess almost 9 years of being editor in chief. He was ultimately pushed out, and he landed somewhere okay before he did his next comic book thing. I guess it was kind of comics, but it wasn't big yet. It was still the same company, but he was going to find his way after. And maybe this interest will do another part if Cal let me. Will go into his period in the 90s where he was a big shot. He was a big shot again. So any last words before we cut this portion of the Jim Shooter story?
Well, let's hear what the people have to say. If you guys would love us to do it, we would love to do Shooter being a big shot in the 90s. And hey, even if you don't want it, we'll probably end up doing it anyway. So something to look forward to.
That is another thing. On a whim, yes. So, but yeah, definitely. I think I have this website up here. Some of the stories I might have to. I don't necessarily believe wholeheartedly, but at the same time, there's some bits in here that was definitely interesting, which I brought up. The original art, which started from Joe Sinnott saying, "Can I get a good page as an inker? Why do I always have to get the dull pages? Can I think no, Joe Sinnott sent it to Stan, and Stan sent the note to Shooter saying, can we somehow get Joe Sinnott a cool page that he did, like, and not just secondary pages all the time." So and that led to something else. But ultimately, thanks for listening. I know it's been a while, but we're gonna try to get back if I can get some free time in this life. But thank you for being there and checking out all the other stuff. Spinner Rack.
We're out.
Out. There's my stop sharing. Sorry you guys have to see this fumbling on my